Okay, Sue, your question.
um, well, I seem to be fascinated with the information that you had given a while back on maybe some of the influence of early Christian either followers of Jesus or like the next generation that may have had an influence on the liturgy or some of the prayers in our prayer book. And so I was wondering if you could repeat what prayer it was that I think you had mentioned. It was the possibility of St. Peter under his Hebrew name that wrote it. And I wondered if there's anything else in our liturgy or prayers that may have had some connection to an early Christian movement as far as, the original people that were actually Jewish.
Right. All right. So actually, I spoke about that a long time ago, and it was nishmat. Okay. And I don't know if this is true or not. I mean, then there's no way to really know. Okay. But there is a rabbinic tradition that attributes nishmat to Saint Peter. Okay. And nishmat, let me find it so I can read the translation. Okay.
I happen to have this book with you.
Okay, but all right. Nishmat kol chai tevarech et shimcha. The breath of all that lives praises you, Adonai, our God. The force that drives all flesh exalts you, our sovereign, always transcending space and time. You are God. Without you, we have no one to rescue and redeem us, to save and sustain us, to show us mercy in disaster and distress. Ruler of all ages, God of all creatures, endlessly extolled. You guide the world with kindness, its creatures with compassion. Adonai, who neither slumbers nor sleeps, you stir the sleeping, give voice to the speechless, free the fettered, support the falling, and raise those bowed down. You alone do we acknowledge. Okay, so
Just ask, do you happen to know what page that was on in that book?
in this book, it was on 104.
Okay.
So
that's the whole Siddur. The whole Siddur?
No, that's the Shabbat Siddur.
Oh, okay.
In your Siddur, wherever we normally begin on Saturday mornings now with Shochenad, it's like a page or two before that.
Okay.
Okay, so you'll be able to find it.
Well, I have all three Siddurs, so I can check that out.
Okay. So yeah, so in the Shabbat only, it's like 104.
Okay.
All right, so I mean, I spoke about this quite some time ago, but if all right, so there's a couple different things. So nishmat kol chai tevarech et shimcha, that means the soul or the breath of everything that lives, right? And so from the perspective of, like, if you look at Maimonides, okay, and obviously Maimonides was way later, but Maimonides says that as much as Christianity has led people astray, it spread the knowledge of God in the world, and it spread the knowledge of Torah in the world. Right? I mean, the Christians acknowledge the Torah as divine, right? From the traditional Jewish perspective, they completely misunderstand and misinterpret it, but they acknowledge its divinity, right? So that Christianity had a positive role in spreading the knowledge of God, okay? At the same time, that the look, there was, and this we know, all right, there was a dispute in the early church, okay, which, right after Jesus's death, okay, about essentially whether you could go from pagan to Christian without passing through Jew, right? And James, who was the brother of Jesus, and the Jerusalem church, Jerusalem Jesus followers, said yes, that we are a Jewish group. And if you want to be part of our group and you're a pagan, you have to convert to Judaism. Right? Paul said no. Right? And so all of this writing about, that the church later interpreted as, observing the mitzvot is worse than useless, Judaism is finished, and so on and so forth. That's all Paul. It's certainly not Jesus. So the idea that some of the rabbis had is that Paul intentionally tried to lead the early Christians out of Judaism for the sake of preserving Judaism, that he was like actually a double agent, right? That he thought it was great that they acknowledged God, but he didn't want them to dilute Judaism, so that erecting the wall more firmly between the church and Judaism actually served the interests of Judaism. Right? Now, I think that this is probably not true, but I don't think it really matters. I mean, we know hardly anything about the historical Saint Peter. But what I think we do know is that, the imagined sharp break between Judaism and Christianity that, conventional wisdom until very recently assumed was like essentially, maybe even while Jesus was still alive, is completely incorrect. That there was a lot of interchange between the two groups. There were a lot of even non-Jewish Christians who still observed bits and pieces of the Jewish law for centuries after. Okay, and that, and it's been a long time since I, really worked in this field. So, but I remember reading one book. It's called Borderlines by Daniel Boyarin, who's a professor of rabbinics he's probably retired now, but at Berkeley. And he says that, the analogy that he gives is, let's say that you are in Spain, you're in northern Spain, and you start walking into France, and you're doing this on foot. Okay, and as you walk, you notice that the language is slowly changing, right? And so where you started, they speak Spanish. right? Where you finish your journey, they speak French. But where exactly is the place where you can say this is the border between French, Spanish, and French? You can't pinpoint it, right? And I mean, it's the same thing with accents, right? I mean, if you and how, I mean, okay, does Alan Katz have a Southern accent? I mean, kind of, but not really, you know, right? I mean, but he has a Maryland accent that people who grow up in Montgomery County today don't have anymore, right? Or the same thing, I have a friend who grew up in Atlanta. I mean, he's 10 years old or more older than, oh, he said, when I grew up, everybody in Atlanta had a Southern accent. Kids growing up in Atlanta don't have Southern accents. But the point is that, political lines on a map are firm, but cultural and linguistic lines are not so firm, right? And so, there's a certain point where you would say the early church was part of Judaism. And there's a certain point where you would say, no, by now, the church is a separate religion. It's not part of Judaism anymore, right? But where to exactly draw that line, that's a process of hundreds of years, right? But because of that, there is, a lot of back and forth between the two. Like, for example, you have midrashim that say that Isaac was killed and resurrected. Okay, now, are the early Christians right now? The early Christians. I mean, it's interesting that what we call the binding of Isaac, the Christians call the sacrifice of Isaac. Okay, but the sort of normative Christian, and I'm speaking gross generalities, obviously, is that Jesus was better than Isaac because Abraham didn't go through with it, but God did. Right? But there's all these parallels, like who carries the wood up to Mount Moriah? Isaac. Right? So now along come these midrashim, and they say, no, Isaac was indeed sacrificed and resurrected. Right? Now, was this a response to Christian claims? I don't know how you could prove it one way or the other, but I think it's likely. Right? And the rabbis are saying, everything that you got from us. And you say, well, we're one step better, but we had it before you. Right? So there's not this hermetic wall. I mean, even if, at a certain point, you can really, really say these are two separate religions. But it doesn't mean that they're not familiar. Right? And it doesn't mean that there's not still that sibling rivalry going on. Like I mean, I mean, there's this line, I think, from Damon Runyon. It's not what he don't know, it's what he does know that just ain't so. And if you like, the conventional wisdom is that Christianity grew out of Judaism. right? That's conventional wisdom, which is completely wrong. Okay, because Christianity did not grow out of Rabbinic Judaism, and Christianity both grew out of biblical Judaism. Right? Rabbinic Judaism is not the same as biblical Judaism. And so, and to a certain extent, post 70, that's the argument, is in a world without a temple, how do we gain atonement? Right? But so it's not X and then Y. It's X and then Y-1 and Y-2.
Well, I think, people tend to think that Christianity comes from Judaism because of, the fact that they use, our scriptures and maybe a lot of references and, the Psalms they use in the liturgy and things like that. But I was wondering, have there been anybody that's written anything about, like, considering everything that has happened, a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment over the years.
Sure.
Do you think that it would have been better if Christianity didn't accept the Hebrew scriptures and just had their gospels?
Well, but that's impossible. I mean, look, there are very few religions that claim that they are something new, right? They all claim to be the continuation of something previous and really the authentic version, right? I mean, so that Christianity without the Hebrew scriptures makes no sense. I mean, in fact, that's a heresy. All right, that is a Christian heresy called Marcionism, which tries to get rid of the Hebrew scriptures. Right? I mean, but if you look at, all right, so the original sort of the Christian claim is that, all right, so God chose Israel, right? And then Israel screwed up. So God took the franchise away from them and gave it to the church. And now the church is the new Israel, right? And that's why, and you have that. I mean, the number of places in America with biblical place names, right? Or, a very popular Anglican hymn, "Until we build Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land," right? So, but then Islam comes along and it says precisely so, right? God chose Israel. Israel screwed up. So God took the franchise from Israel and gave it to the church. And then the church screwed up. So God took the franchise from them and gave it to Islam, right? And then, every movement within that says that, and it took until, the early 1960s for the church to realize that the same logic by which they said Judaism is superseded worked for the Muslim claim that Christianity was superseded, right? And that's where you have as early, as 1964, Nostra Aetate, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, right? God doesn't make promises and then go back on them, right? But if you look at, why do the Shia in Iran persecute the Baha'i so much, right? Because the Muslim claim is that Jesus is the last prophet, right? And the Baha'i faith is an outgrowth of Shiite Islam, but they have more prophets, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's fun to be a Christian or a Jew in Iran, but it's a lot better to be a Christian or Jew in Iran than to be a Baha'i in Iran. Because Islam says, let the Christians and Jews, leave them alone. It doesn't say leave the Baha'i alone, right? Because they are far worse from the perspective of the Shiites, right? And every, if you look at every right movement, they claim to be restoring what was lost, right? Protestantism, oh, the Catholic Church went away, we're restoring what was lost, right? The Mormons, right? They, all of Christianity went astray. God sent the Book of Mormon to Joseph Smith to restore the pristine glory of the original church, right? Nobody ever claims to be something new. They're always, because that's building your house on a foundation of sand. But it certainly, it would have been better historically if maybe Peter's goal had succeeded, right? To get back to your original question, which is to say, Christianity is dumbed down Judaism for the Goy, right? And that, but there's no rivalry that's as bloody as sibling rivalry, right? And as long as you have this sort of exclusive view, right, that there can be only one heir, then there's, right, and that's not just in religion. Look at Stalin and Trotsky, right? Why did Stalin have to have Trotsky killed? Right? Because Lenin can only have one true heir. And is it Stalin or is it Trotsky?
On a slightly different topic, I was wondering, I didn't get to watch it, but there was a program on TV on a Jewish channel that talked about the fact, evidently, I didn't realize this, that Israel doesn't have a constitution. And, the question was whether some of the situations that are coming up now could be avoided if they had a constitution. And I really don't know anything about that, but, I wonder, has there been talk about having a constitution now, or what is the reason for not having one?
All right, so I'll answer your first question second, I'll answer your first question first. There is discussion of having a constitution, right? It has come up in the context of all of this stuff that's going on with the judicial, whatever you want to call it, right? The proponents call it the reform, the opponents call it the over, whatever. there is no written constitution. I mean, the question about whether Israel has a constitution or not is different than whether it has a written constitution, because, for example, the UK doesn't have a written constitution either. But it's certainly, I think anybody would say it's a constitutional monarchy, right? I mean, it's just not written. But the original plan was to write a constitution. Okay, and the first Knesset was supposed to produce a constitution. That it never happened. And the primary reason that it never happened is that the Orthodox parties said, we don't need a constitution. We have a constitution. It's called the Torah. Okay, and that anything, I mean, if you look at the Declaration of Independence of Israel, where it promises freedom of religion, it promises equality of the sexes, right? I mean, we still don't have any legal guarantee of equality of the sexes in the United States, right? But Israel had it in their Declaration of Independence in 48, right? So there are things in the Declaration of Independence that the Orthodox parties back then would not have accepted as part of the Constitution, and everybody else would not have agreed to not have them in the Constitution, right? So it never happened. There is some discussion that a constitution would be a way out of this morass. And it probably would be, but if anything, look, back in 48, in the early part of the state, the Haredi parties basically, they wanted nothing to do with the whole enterprise, right? And so when you say the Orthodox rejected, we're really talking about the modern Orthodox, right? Today, I mean, Netanyahu's government, first of all, I mean, the so-called modern Orthodox are much more extreme than they were back then. I mean, at least politically, vis-a-vis, settlements and all of that. But the Netanyahu government also depends on the Haredi parties. So, if a constitution requires a sort of broad consensus, right? Like maybe not 100%, but let's say 80%. I mean, I'm an optimistic person, but I don't see anything gaining that kind of broad consensus. So I just don't see it happening. But I'm not, I'm not on the scene. So I can only tell you, what I'm reading and what I know of Israeli society.
And one other thing, I just want to say, I personally agree with what you wrote about the prayer for the state of Israel. I guess that's one of the things that, I like about conservative Judaism rather than Reformed, is that I do like to hold on to some traditions, liturgy and prayers and things like that. And I agree that saying that same prayer, is like, it's comforting to me to know that it's been said for so long, and that, like you say, it could be interpreted differently. But, things in the past have happened in our country right here, and I don't necessarily agree with it, but I'm not willing to pack up my bags and leave, and I'm not willing to say that the whole country is terrible just because I might not agree politically.
Right.
I have the hope that things will change, and in democracies, things do tend to change. And I do find it really disturbing that a lot of Jewish people seem to like have the attitude that if Israel isn't perfect, they don't want anything to do with it. Or if it doesn't make changes that I agree might be the best changes, and it unfortunately might make changes that are not good, they're willing to, throw the dishes out with the dishwater or whatever the saying is. And
Right.
I think that, to me, Israel is a vital part of my Judaism. And the idea that you would talk against the country and not like it just because, like I believe that you can voice your opinion of change. And I also believe you can be critical of what they're doing, but to be critical of the whole thing instead of narrowing it down to being critical of what's going on in a particular political thing.
Right.
That I find that very, very troubling to me.
Yeah, and I do too. But I like to always say, but on the other, right? The question is there a line, beyond which you can't go anymore, right? If you look at, we have a situation right now since 1967, right? The population of the territories is now like 3 million people, right? And so, Israel on paper has always said, look, we are holding these territories as a bargaining chip in return for full peace with the Arab world, right? And then Israel committed itself to a two-state solution and negotiating process with the Palestinians, and eventually, but at the same time, it's like Israel has taken more and more steps that make a two-state solution more and more impossible. All right. This does not gainsay the fact that the Palestinians have also taken many steps that cause the Israelis to have good reason not to trust the Palestinians, right? But, at a certain point, you have 3 million people who have no right to vote and no say over their own future, right? And so far, and Netanyahu's been smart in this regard. He's resisted pressure to annex the territories, right? In fact, the whole Abraham Accords, he explicitly said, right? The Gulf states said, we will sign a peace treaty with you and establish diplomatic relations and trade and, flights, and it's a warm peace. It's not like the cold peace with Egypt. But you have to promise not to annex the territories. And he said, fine. And I give him credit for that, absolutely. But at a certain point, the blessing for Israel is that the Palestinians, have been stupid, right? And instead of saying forthrightly, we accept the existence of Israel we don't want to replace it. We want equal rights within this state. If they ever said that, very, very hard to explain why that shouldn't be the case. And, you know, this is the problem. I mean, you know, is there a point? In other words, right? So if you look at the protests that are going on in Israel, right? And so people in the Israeli real left, okay, say, look, why are Palestinian citizens of Israel not participating in these protests, right? And they're not because the Israeli flag has become the symbol of the protests, right? And how can, and I'm talking about Palestinian citizens of Israel. I'm not talking about West Bank people, right? That flag can't really ever represent Palestinian citizens of Israel. The Magen David, right? And they're saying that, you know, you're saving Israeli democracy for Jews, but what about for us? Right? My response to that is, look, if Israel's not a democracy for Jews anymore, you think your situation is going to be better? It's going to be worse, right? I mean, if there's ever going to be a solution that gives something approaching equality to Jews and Palestinians, right? It's only going to be with a democratic Israel. It's not going to be with a Hungary style or Putin style autocratic Israel, right? I mean, you know, if you've got, you know, if you've got cancer and a broken foot, like, let's deal with the cancer first and worry about the broken foot later, you know? I mean, but the criticism is not wrong. It's just a question, I think, of priorities and a timetable. You know, and that's the same criticism of the Abraham Accords, is that to a certain extent, you know, it allowed Israel to kick the can down the road, right? I mean, in the same way that, look, I mean, if you look at our own situation, right? Everybody understood that the current path that our shul is on is non-viable, right? But every proposed solution had people who objected to it, right? And, oh, we went through such a trauma 11 years ago, we can't go through another trauma. So let's just keep kicking the can down the road, right? And now we're at a point where we can't keep kicking the can down the road anymore, right? And you know, whatever solution we come up with is gonna upset some people. But, you know, and when you have a non-viable situation, I don't know that you're really well served by creating a situation that is constantly allowing the can to be kicked down the road.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And I definitely have no problem with people, you know, I mean, if Jews are going to feel connected to Israel and be a part, then it, you know, I don't see any problem with them, you know, giving, you know, criticism or constructive criticism to Israel. I mean, obviously Israel isn't doing everything right. But I think giving, like here in the United States, we might give constructive criticism. We might make suggestions and do things, but it doesn't mean that we're going to just, oh, if you don't do it our way, or if you don't do it, instead of constructive dialogue, we're just gonna scratch you off the list, you know.
No, here I agree with you. I mean, Israel is the only nation state whose very existence is considered up for debate, right? Nobody says, well, George Floyd was murdered, so maybe the United States shouldn't exist anymore, right? No, I agree with you. I mean, it's a real problem. If I remember, I'll send you an article from the Forward. I actually quoted from it in what I wrote yesterday, but I'll send you the whole article.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, because it's really good, and I fully agree with it.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know.
Sure.
When I read things about it and people's reactions, I find some people's reactions are very, very disturbing to me because, like I say, we've had things in the past in our own country, that have been terrible. And that doesn't mean that all of us are going to, throw away our American documents and say, this country's going down the tubes, let's get rid of it.
Right. No, and look, I think that there is a certain tendency to see things in black and white instead of shades of gray. Right. And I know this because my first rabbinic job, I was the Hillel director at the University of Virginia. Right. And look, when I was working there from 88 to 91, it's not like people didn't know that Jefferson had slaves and that Jefferson had children with Sally Hemings and all of that, right? Or that, the original campus of UVA was built with slave labor, but nobody spoke about it, right? And now the pendulum has gone over completely the other way. And the way that they did it in the 80s and 90s was wrong. And the pendulum all the way that is also wrong. Thomas Jefferson was a great person who articulated great ideals that he himself did not always live up to. Right? And I think that is a fair statement. And, so he was a flawed human being. He wasn't a saint and he wasn't the devil. He was a flawed human being who was quite aware of his own flaws and was quite aware of the contradiction between what he wrote in the Declaration of Independence and the existence of slavery in the United States. He was quite aware of it. He didn't manage to solve it, and maybe he could have done more, but so I agree. If you have to, seeing the country warts and all is really important. Right. And we don't want to go down the DeSantis route and deny, the flaws of our country, but we don't want to, pretend that, there are flaws, but, and even, if you look at, people still are willing to risk death to come here for all its flaws.
Well, you had also mentioned, Rabbi, about the fact that we don't have any perfect heroes in our Bible.
Right.
That, we're not going to say that Moses and, all of the people weren't, great people, but they were all flawed.
Right.
And they all made mistakes and none of them were perfect.
Right. Absolutely.
So I agree, and I think it's easier almost to admire somebody like that, because you can identify, because nobody's perfect.
Right. I mean, that's certainly from my perspective, that's why the biblical figures are so much more appealing, precisely because they're flawed and you can identify with them.
Well, I sometimes wonder, I had seen a program or read something about back during the days of slavery, there wasn't a huge Jewish presence in this country from the little bit that I know, but there were, and in the South, where many of the Jews were traders or had stores, little stores, and you wonder, like, what went through their mind when they celebrated Passover. And even if they didn't have slaves, that culture was all around them. And I've never read anything, but I wondered if there was any like firsthand accounts from any of those people, just to find out what their rationale and thinking
There were, and the existence of American chattel slavery depended on dehumanizing Africans, that they weren't fully human, right? And and there were rabbis on both sides of the slavery debate. I mean, there was a rabbi in Baltimore named David Einhorn who had to flee for his life from Baltimore because he was anti-slavery.
Wow.
And at the same time, there was, I forget the name, but there was a prominent rabbi in New York who wrote pro-slavery tracts that the Southerners, quoted.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. I'd like to take a class or something in that at some point. That would be fascinating, I think.
All right. Well, thank you, Sue. Nice to
Thank
spend
you,
some time
Rabbi.
with you.
Thank you for giving such wonderful answers. I really appreciated it.
All right. Well, maybe sometimes they'll be even correct.
Oh, they always are.
Oh, okay. All right. Good
Thank
night.
you. And Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Bye-bye.
Bye.